Neale Donald Walsch's life had fallen into complete disarray. Everything he once had seemed to collapse overnight. His career had failed, his family had broken apart, and his friends had left him. He felt as if his life was like a crumbling house, teetering on the edge of collapse, ready to fall at any moment. In his loneliest and most desperate hour, Neale picked up a pen and wrote a question to God. Why do I suffer? Is suffering necessary? To his surprise, he received an answer. This marked the beginning of an extraordinary conversation between him and God. Suffering is not necessary. God's response was simple and direct, as if it were common knowledge, yet it challenged everything Neale had believed. He had always thought that suffering was an inevitable part of life, a trial that every soul must endure to grow. But now, God was telling him that suffering is a choice, not something that must be experienced as a part of life. Neale was confused. If suffering isn't necessary, then why do I still feel so much pain? Why does life always seem to be full of challenges? God explained, suffering is not caused by events themselves, but by your reaction to them. Events are just phenomena. They have no emotional charge of their own. The meaning you attach to events determines whether or not you suffer. This answer left Neale deep in thought. Losing his job, going bankrupt, his divorce, these events that seemed so devastating, were they really just phenomena? Was his suffering simply his reaction to these occurrences, rather than the events themselves causing the pain? Neale struggled to grasp this new perspective. He had always believed he was a victim of life's misfortunes, trapped in circumstances beyond his control. But now, God was telling him that he was not powerless. He had the ability to choose how to perceive and respond to everything that happened in his life. You can choose how to respond to life's events. You can choose love, forgiveness, acceptance, or you can choose fear, anger, and resistance. Each choice leads to vastly different outcomes. Suffering comes from choosing fear and resistance in the face of life's challenges. Neale reflected on these words. He thought back to the many setbacks in his life. His business failed, his marriage fell apart, his close relationships betrayed him. Each time, he chose anger, despair, and helplessness. He felt abandoned by life, mocked by fate. But now, God was telling him that he didn't have to react that way. He could choose to face life's challenges in a completely new way. But why would we choose suffering? Neale asked. If there's a better option, why do we keep falling into the same cycles of pain? God's answer left Neale stunned. Because you have been taught to believe that suffering is a part of life, even the only path to spiritual growth. Many religions and cultures have instilled in you the idea that suffering is a way to purify the soul, a necessary step toward greatness. Neale immediately thought of the education and religious teachings he had absorbed throughout his life. From childhood, he had been taught to endure suffering, that to bear pain was a noble virtue. In Christian teachings, Jesus' suffering on the cross was portrayed as a sacred sacrifice. In Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths teach that suffering is an intrinsic part of life. Suffering seemed to be linked to the soul's elevation, to loyalty and devotion to God. But suffering is not God's creation, God continued. Suffering is the result of your misunderstanding of life, the consequence of not using the tools that God has already given you. Neale fell into silence again. Suffering was not God's creation? This revelation forced him to reconsider his life, to rethink his understanding of suffering. What are these tools you're talking about? Neale asked. God's answer came with warmth and compassion. These tools are love, forgiveness, acceptance, and trust. They have always been within you, but you have forgotten they exist. Suffering is not something you must endure. It is simply the result of not using these tools. Love, forgiveness, and acceptance, Neale repeated to himself. He began to realize that his life had indeed lacked these qualities. He had been harsh with himself, constantly disappointed and angry with others. He always felt that life was unfair, seeing himself as the perpetual loser in a giant game. God continued, suffering exists to remind you when you have strayed from the path of love. It's a signal that you need to return to the path God set for you. When you learn to see everything in life through the lens of love and acceptance, suffering loses its power over you. Suddenly, Neale realized that his past self had always resisted the inconveniences and misfortunes of life. He resisted the things he couldn't control. He refused to accept reality and couldn't forgive those who had hurt him. But now, he understood that suffering wasn't caused by these events themselves. It was caused by his refusal to accept them, to forgive, and to see the love that could come out of them. But how do I learn not to suffer? Neale asked. How can I stop feeling hurt in the face of life's setbacks and difficulties? How do I use these tools? God's response was filled with wisdom. You cannot control the events that happen in life, but you can choose how to respond to them. You can choose to respond to everything with love, to dissolve hatred with forgiveness, and to face unchangeable realities with acceptance. Whenever you encounter a challenge in life, ask yourself, what can I learn from this experience? How can I respond to this with love? Neale began to understand the depth of these words. He realized that suffering wouldn't magically disappear in a single moment. Life's challenges would continue to happen, but he could choose how to interpret and face those challenges. He could choose to forgive those who had hurt him, to accept the things he couldn't change, and to face the future with love and gratitude. From that point on, Neale consciously applied the tools God had spoken of. When he encountered difficulties in life, he no longer reacted with immediate anger or sadness. Instead, he paused and asked himself, how can I respond with love? What can I learn from this? Can I accept this reality? One day, Neale received a phone call from his ex-wife. The call shocked him, as their divorce had been filled with arguments and resentment. He never thought they would speak peacefully again. On the other end, her voice was calm. I know we went through a lot in the past, she said, but I want to tell you that I forgive you. I hope you can forgive me too. Neale's heart filled with complex emotions. In the past, his first reaction might have been anger and rejection, thinking she was only apologizing out of guilt. But now, he felt something different. He felt the power of forgiveness. He realized that the resentment he had held against his ex-wife was one of the roots of his own suffering. He chose to forgive her, not for her sake, but to free himself. I forgive you, Neale said calmly. And I forgive myself. As Neale spoke these words, he felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his heart. The pain he had clung to for so long seemed to fade in importance. The suffering hadn't suddenly disappeared, but it no longer felt sharp, because he had chosen forgiveness and acceptance. This is the power of using love, forgiveness, and acceptance, God whispered in his heart. When you choose to face every challenge in life with these tools, suffering no longer rules over you. You'll find that peace and joy take its place. Neale's life changed dramatically from that moment on. He no longer saw himself as a victim of life but as the creator of his own destiny. He understood that challenges and difficulties were inevitable, but he could choose how to face them. He could choose love instead of fear, forgiveness instead of resentment, acceptance instead of resistance. Are you ready to move forward without letting suffering dominate your life? God asked. Neale smiled and nodded firmly. He knew that this moment of awakening had already transformed his life. He was no longer afraid of suffering, because he now possessed the power to transcend it, the power of love, forgiveness, and acceptance. This story teaches us that suffering is not a necessary part of life. It is the result of how we choose to respond to life's events. Through his conversation with God, Neale Donald Walsch discovered a simple yet profound truth. Suffering stems from our reactions to events, not from the events themselves. Every person has the ability to change their thoughts and attitudes, to transcend suffering, and find inner peace and joy. Love, forgiveness, and acceptance are tools that God has given each of us. As long as we are willing to use them, suffering will lose its hold on us. True happiness comes from how we choose to face every moment in life. That choice is always in our hands. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and like the video so you won't miss any new spiritual insights and opportunities for growth.